But now, let's turn to the question of how to act strategically in a changing global aid landscape.
Yeah. Our next speaker has been working a lot with using rigorous evidence and having it to inform in areas such as health, education, innovation, governance, so on. She served as the chief economist in the UK Development Administration. She's been the president of JPAL, and she's now the president of the independent research organization, the Center for Global Development. Please welcome Mr. Rachel Glennerster. Welcome, Professor. It is not on, and it's not, there's no light. So, okay.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, so I was asked to talk about aid in a new era, so I thought it was, I'll start with just why it's a new era. And a lot of people have been saying it's a new era because of aid cuts, and that's true. But it's also a new era because development and aid have been a spectacular success. We've had a 60% reduction in poverty, a halving of child mortality, and that's at the personal level. But I think what's even more important in thinking strategically about how we do aid is that countries have changed. So we've had a dramatic fall in the number of low-income countries. So this is, you know, and so India, many parts of Africa, Indonesia have changed from this dark purple to light purple, which means that they've moved from being low-income countries to middle-income countries. And that really has to change how we work. So a new era means a new strategy. So in particular, it means that because we've had these dramatic successes, it means that ending poverty is now doable. So it would take 0.3% of global GDP to lift every single person up from extreme poverty to the poverty line. That assumes perfect targeting, so it would actually take a little bit more than that. But you know, it's the case that now a large number of the extreme poor live in middle-income countries who can and are spending a lot of their own money in reducing poverty. So both it means that ending extreme poverty is doable, but also we need a new way of thinking about how to do it. And so some of these countries are, as I say, some of the countries with a lot of extreme poor can self-fund. They are spending a very large amount of money on reducing poverty. And for them, we need to give them, better trade, but also innovation and evidence are extremely important. So we've been talking about evidence-based aid, but I want you to also think about providing evidence to middle-income countries like Kenya to spend their own money more effectively. So providing them innovation, things like a malaria vaccine, opens up their ability to, treat their own population more effectively, and generating the evidence on what's the most effective way to do education and health is extremely important in helping them spend their money more effectively. Now there are other countries that are middle-income countries but still need a lot of support, and the remaining low-income countries are the ones that haven't been able to improve. So they are in worse condition than many of low-income countries in the past, so they don't need a lot more help. So this is just a chart that shows you what percent of GDP different countries would need to spend to bring their population up. So when we were talking about the strategy, using data to do strategy, this is an example. So in the UK, we use this to prioritize our aid. If you could get all your population up above the poverty line by spending less than 1% of GDP, we weren't going to give you aid, right? Because you could do it on your own. So these kinds of numbers are really useful for targeting your aid. The other lesson, which is what we're talking about here, is invest in evidence and innovation. And again, most money that is spent on anti-poverty programs is spent by low and middle income countries themselves. So a key thing that donors can do is generate the evidence, synthesize the evidence, and help get the evidence out to help countries help themselves. So 2 examples, both in India and in Indonesia, a small amount of money from aid donors funded impact evaluations, rigorous impact evaluations on different ways to improve the poverty programs run by India and Indonesia themselves. And in both cases, I think one is 24% and one is 25%. But anyway, it very roughly, those programs improve the effectiveness of that research, improve the effectiveness of these domestic anti-poverty programs by 25%. So they saved billions of dollars in India and Indonesia. They got a lot more money to poor people. So that is a highly, highly leveraged use of aid money to fund the research that improves the domestic poverty program. And then innovation, things like, aid-supported flood-resilient rice in India that massively increased investment by farmers in India, and it, helped create a pneumococcal vaccine which saves 700,000 lives just in the first 10 years. And my second piece of advice is to radically simplify, because when you're trying to use evidence to improve your aid program, it's much easier to do if you're doing a few things well. We've talked a lot already in my time here in Sweden about Christmas tree projects that try and cope with all the issues facing, in a given sector. So I've seen agricultural programs that build roads, that provide fertilizer, that provide improved seeds, that train farmers, and that address basic literacy of farmers, all in one program. Well, that's not a good way to run a program. It's much too complicated to do. Much better to pick which of those things is the most cost-effective thing to do, and then do it in the whole country, instead of trying to do everything in one small district in the country. So we need to focus grant money on the poorest countries, except, as I say, for this, evidence and innovation side of aid, specialize in a few highly cost-effective things and become the real expert. So a bilateral agency can become the expert on doing graduation programs or improving tax policy. Pick a few things and then really specialize in that. And you're not doing the same thing everywhere. You're doing, you're picking the places that need that program that you're expert in. Fewer, bigger programs, simpler programs, and fund evidence generation that improves the cost effectiveness of what everyone is doing around the world. And this is just a chart that shows the costs of doing small programs and how much more cost effective it is to do larger, simpler programs. So this is the number of households served and the cost per dollar of reaching a person. So if you, and the IRC has done this for many different things. They've done it for latrines and cash and non-cash payments. And you see that the cost per person reached is much, much smaller when you're reaching a lot of people. So in conclusion, we're in a new era because we've had dramatic success. Bilateral agencies have a unique role to play in generating the evidence, not only for themselves, but for the rest of the world. And in supporting the poorest countries who can't relieve poverty all on their own. And, you know, we should do a few highly cost-effective things at very big scale.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I, of course, have several follow-up questions, but I also saw in the audience that there was some reaction at some point, and so I would actually like to start by opening up for questions from the audience.
Thank you very much. My name is Matthias Kryger from SIDA. Thanks for an excellent presentation. I'm just wondering, we seem to a little bit forget the democracy human rights perspective here. Is this an argument for reduce poverty first and we'll see what happens later with democracy and human rights?
Should I take them one by one or?
Yeah, you can start answering that, and then we have a few.
Okay, so actually quite a lot of my own research is on democracy and human rights. And so you might assume that everything I said is just about health and education. But actually, we have quite a lot of rigorous research on how to improve democracy, less on human rights, I should say, but on democracy and accountability of politicians. So, for example, in my own research, we looked at funding debates between candidates. And that is something actually that an external donor can do, is to fund debates between candidates, because you're not telling them what to say or what's good, you're not summarizing their positions, you're letting them speak for themselves. And what we found when you did that, and these were played on the radio, they were played, they were videoed and shown in cinema halls, which you basically in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, people will go to a central place to watch television and watch particularly football games. And we paid the places that played the local football games, to play these debates. And we saw that politicians were more accountable, they went back to there, and they were less corrupt if they had been randomly picked to be part of a debate. So that's just one of them. So you can do this on, pick pretty much any topic, and you can do this kind of rigorous evaluation on it.
Thanks. One question in the back.
Okay. And by the way, radio. Supporting local radio is one of the most effective ways to improve accountability and democracy.
Okay, so let's start there, and then there.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. My name is Anna-Mia Ekström. I'm one of the expert group members of EBA. I would like to hear your view on Sweden's policy on Tanzania, which is a low-income country that Sweden has supported for decades, but now is sort of phasing out in 6 months, and also with what is happening with democracy in Tanzania. Do you think there was a correct decision to withdraw from Tanzania in this? And do you think 6 months is a responsible sort of phase-out period?
Okay.
Shall we take another question?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so down there. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Anzi Hassan Ali, and I'm the development analyst at the chief economist team at CEDA. My question is, what do agencies like us need to change in the era of, you talked about generating evidence, but then there's also like too much knowledge and evidence, not just from the evaluations, but from a lot of field experiences and everything. And then also in the era of new technology and things like that. But also in terms of what skill sets needs to be there internally for us to actually do this in practice. I think this new era also demands new skill sets. So could you comment on that, please? Thank you.
Okay, so, you know, I don't know Tanzania, I have not worked there. I know that democracy is under real threat there. I do think that it's, you know, so I'm not going to comment on, you know, how fast you pull out or that. I do think that it is the right thing to focus on a smaller number of countries, because just like that curve that I showed you for a given program, there's a lot of fixed costs in working in one country. And so it's much better if instead, and you know, I've worked with ministers who are trying to cope with all these different aid organizations, and it takes a huge amount of their time. And you know, everyone wants to see them, and then they get a tiny, tiny amount of money. So it's much better if you work in a fewer countries and put more money into those few countries. You know, obviously getting there is a challenge, like what's the right way to pull out. On what it means for, what this new era means for development agencies, I think it's, so one slide that I regretted not including in here is my slide on how you practically do evidence-based policy within an aid agency and how you use different kinds of evidence at different points in the process. Okay, so I have this schematic that I use pretty much in every time I'm faced with a question. And it says, use evidence to decide what the problem is. And then, and so that means, you know, in one country it might be getting kids in school, another country it might be most of the kids are in school but they're not learning. Or is it that girls are dropping out at, you know, in order to have child marriage, or is it that boys are dropping out because they, you know, need to work to generate? So there's a lot of data and evidence that you can use. It's not randomized trials, it's descriptive evidence that you use to determine what is the problem that you're going to tackle. What is the local problem? The next point is, what is the evidence about what works to address that problem? This is where you need causally identified evidence that is generated from around the world, because you will never have enough studies in that particular country on that particular problem. And this is where the skills comes, because it is, when I was working in the UK aid agency, that skill to take that data and evidence and figure out that it applies to my condition is a skill, right? But there are a lot of groups working on synthesizing the data and synthesizing all the rigorous evaluations in the world and pulling out what are the general lessons from it, right? What are we learning about human behavior that applies everywhere in the world, pretty much? And then, after you've, you know, picked what you want to, what's the problem, how have other people tackled it, and what is general human behavior that we need to try and change, and how does that general human behavior get changed? Then the last piece is, how do I implement it in this country? And that is where you bring all in the institutional knowledge of, do I have small sub-centers or do I have big clinics? Are the nurses showing up? Like all this deep institutional knowledge about the country that comes in at the end. Like, can I use mobile phones to get the information out? No, half the country doesn't have a mobile phone. Or yes, everyone has a phone, right? So you need different kinds of evidence at these 3 different levels. And they take different skills. So I do think there is a lot of skill in using evidence and applying it. And I was lucky in FCDO that we had we had these cadres who really knew the evidence in their different areas, but we worked really hard to keep them up, up to the latest evidence. That was encouraged by the fact that they knew that in order to get a project through, it was going to be reviewed for the evidence, and they wouldn't get their project through unless it was up on the latest evidence, right? So there was a real bureaucratic incentive to keep up with the evidence, but you do need that skill, absolutely.
Can I link that one to your call for simplification at another level as well? Because, I mean, you're talking about simplification in terms of choice of countries, but also within sectors, but also in the design of kind of interventions and so on, and all those 3 are in there. But, I mean, definitely the choice of where to work in countries, but also quite often in terms of sectors, those are political decisions. So in terms of having evidence inform those decisions, because you talk quite a lot about using it at the agents level, but what would be your thoughts about linking a bit to Anna-Mia's question on working in Tanzania?
It's always a political decision, but it can be an evidence-informed political decision. Right? So having these sort of rules of thumb like, do we really want to be putting in a lot of aid to a country which very soon will be able to, fund its own exit from poverty, or do we want to do it differently? So I think, it's not that the UK does nothing in India anymore, but it doesn't fund services, so it does investment-related projects that, help, and we provide loans there through the DFI. So the Chief Economist's Office would put up, based on the evidence, its assessment of what countries we should cover and how much of the different countries, and then it would go into a political process. So the objective is not for it all to be evidence, but it is, you want evidence to have some role.
It should be evidence-informed, not evidence-based. So you should know when you're doing things that are not in line what you actually know is working.
Yeah, and there's other kinds of evidence like, do we have a particularly good relationship and there's a reforming minister who will actually take on board, will restructure things. So, if you look at the data and say there's lots of poor people, but the political decision might be, but they're not going to listen to us, so there's no point in going there. It might or might not be true in Tanzania.
We have one question from the audience there and there. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Andres, also a member of EBA, otherwise working on humanitarian issues with the Red Cross. Thanks for a fantastic presentation, I think. I think many of us are a little bit depressed daily, but this was really kind of a boost in that regard. It's almost like having Hans Rosling back in the room, in a way, right? No, but I think you kind of answered the question I had, but I think the obvious one is that you make it sound very, very simple. So the question is, why don't we do it? Or is it that we actually do it? And I'm not speaking we, the small we, Sweden, and the larger we, the global community. Are we or are we not? And if not, why?
So I think we've made a lot of progress in using evidence in development over the years. We now have a lot more evidence. So, in the past, we didn't know what was more cost effective. And there is still relatively, there's quite a lot of studies on what works, many fewer that give you detailed cost data to be able to do the cost effectiveness analysis. So when I'm talking about evidence, there's lots of things that there's evidence that they work. What we really need to hone in on is which are the most cost-effective things, because that's where you get the 10, 100 times more impact when you focus on those. So I think we are getting better. there's now more evidence to be able to do things in these hard to do sectors like democracy. But I think part of the issue is these complicated projects, because you will often find one of the 25 things they're trying to do is evidence-based, but then they add that. Now, I think there are bureaucratic incentives that lead us to these very complicated projects, right? And so I think we need to tackle those bureaucratic incentives. So, for example, when your project goes through a review, it gets reviewed by the environment team, and they say, well, how about adding this? And it gets reviewed by the political economy team that says, how about adding this? And so we need to make the review process not lead to all these added bells and whistles, which may or may not be evidenced. So, you know, gender is a really good example of this. You know, I passionately believe that you should be thinking about gender when you design a project. And a lot of agencies have that rule, and it needs to be looked at by a gender person. But too often the result is you just stick a little add-on for the women. That is both a terrible way to think about gender. Oh, just give the women a little bit of money and then the big project can be for the men, right? So it's terrible gender politics. It's also, you just then have these little add-ons all over the place to kind of deal with these environments. Like, that's not the way to do it. The way to think about gender is to say, in my main big project, am I going to end up screwing women without realizing it, right? So that's what I want the gender team to do, not, oh, add a little thing to keep the women happy.
But
right?
would then mainstreaming, I mean, a well-working kind of gender project, would that be kind of less complicated then? Because it doesn't seem that simple. I mean, mainstreaming is, I think everyone that works with it.
Done properly, I think it is. It's saying, you know, with a land reform program, which is important for farmers, you know, does the registration include the ability for now, I can't remember the exact details, but there was a big World Bank project where they looked at providing land tenuring and registration, and they found that only men were getting it. And they tweaked the way you did the registration, so the fundamental part of the whole project, to be in a way that women then were able to get the tenure.
Okay.
So it's not adding on a bit, it's changing.
That's redesigning in order to tackle unintended effects of a program, right?
Absolutely. So it's not adding things, it's redesigning to make sure that it doesn't have negative effects. So that's, I think, how you do gender. And so we've got to rethink all of our structures to make sure that the incentives are there for simplification and for evidence. So I would be in favor of saying, if there are, you know, things that we know are highly cost effective, and you want to do a project, you don't have to do a project on those, you know, things that are listed, but if you do a project on that, and only that, the review process is, you know, 2 weeks instead of 3 months. I bet you will find that the bureaucracy will respond.
Okay, we have at least 3 more questions
Yes.
from the
And
audience.
I know the order.
Yep.
So we have one first here.
And then, let's take, so there's actually 4 of them. So shall we make, and I know that time is about to end, so I might ask you also to respond quickly to them. So we're one there, one in the back, and one up here. And we take all 4 of them in a row, right?
Thank you so much. My name is Maria Torin. I work as a humanitarian advisor at SIDA. I cover cash, among other topics. And within the humanitarian sector, we know that cash can save 40% of resources compared to in-kind. We also know that it's only still below 20% of all humanitarian aid, and it's going down, while it should be around 40% at least. So I think it's interesting how you present the simplification, your recommendation of looking at highly cost-effective things, do one thing and do it well, do it at scale. That's what we've heard within the humanitarian sector, but it hasn't happened yet. So I would like, maybe if you could say a few more things about the evidence on cash compared to in-kind, in development and in humanitarian settings. Thank you.
Great. We're going to
please.
collect all the
Yeah.
questions.
Please, here, Malin. There.
Are you sure you have the order right? Okay.
Yeah, I am sure. Up, up, up.
Hello?
Yeah.
I don't want to cut any cues, but yeah. I'm Ulrika Hoff. I work with the Prime Minister's office and at these topics specifically. And we, as you mentioned, the Swedish government has been trying to sort of get more focused and with fewer strategies and sort of better effectiveness. I also have a background in the FCDO, so it was great to get reacquainted with the role of the chief economist, and I think that's something that we should all be inspired to look into, that way of working in Sweden as well. I was wondering if you had done any thinking about sort of donor coordination in terms of effectiveness, especially in a time where the global sort of pie is shrinking and we all need to do our piece and make sure, even better than before, not to overlap, but also not to cause any voids when different donors might be pulling out from certain countries at the same time. Thank you.
Two more.
Okay. Thank you. Eric Berghoff, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So, first of all, a very nice and very inspiring presentation. I had a reflection more than, inspired by several things you said. From my own experience, it's actually the process of integrating the evaluation into the project as such as you know, when you structure the implementation of the project, you build in elements that allow you to measure impact. And I used to say that the best randomized control trial that I was involved in never happened. But when we went through the process of establishing what is the strategic alternative to this intervention and how do we make sure that we capture some sort of non-intervention and we have can use that meaningful data collection in that process. So. And what in the process of thinking through that, we sort of realized that it cannot be that what we are doing is better than the alternative, and in a sense that we didn't have to do a very costly randomized control trial. So I'm just, particularly when you were speaking about gender and those things, I mean, how to integrate this deeply into the project and make sure that we get baseline data, we get clear, as you say, relatively quickly readings that allow us to act on it.
Thank you. And a final question?
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Kristina de Carol Eriksson. I work at SIDA. And we have, for many years, and the minister also mentioned, building institutions. That takes time, and there are a lot of factors that influence it over decades, I would say. I've been working with, for example, building research capacity and working with universities, PhD programs and so on. So when you say look at what works and measuring that, it sounds very short term. And how can we actually see if building institutions in an effective way as a basis for development in our partner countries is an effective way to work? Thank you.
Thanks. And I know it will be a challenge to try to respond to all of this quickly, but yeah,
okay.
Give it a try.
I'll give it a go. Cash, I know you wanted me to say more about cash, but given the time, a lot of evidence that it's highly effective. It's a great way to do big programs and get, spend money without a lot of it going on design and, so it's, I think there is resistance in some areas. I mean, one of the things I think Sweden can push on is the UN system, which doing more on cash, and in particular, they are doing more on cash, but they tend to do, every agency does their own cash thing. I mean, I really think this is a place where donor coordination is needed. You just have to say, not putting up with that anymore. In one camp, we're going to have one agency that does cash, that's it. And I think now, in this current crisis with money going down, you have a lot of leverage as long as you go with other agencies. So that's an example of donor coordination. I think so there's a lot in, where you work with multilateral organizations, where you should be coming together and pushing reform. For example, the World Bank is still giving way too much IDA money to, much richer countries. If you've got less concessional money, really focusing on the poor. I mean, there's a lot of places where, again, if you have donor coordination, you can push through those changes. I think evidence generation and synthesis is something that you can really coordinate on very effectively and easily, because coordination country by country is a lot of work and it doesn't always work. So it would be great if we could pull it off. I think one thing to do is pick a few donors like the Nordic Plus, where you are working very closely together, and coordinate at least with them. We need to get the World Bank back into running those country coordination platforms that they used to do, because you need somebody kind of pulling everything together. So there's a few ideas on coordination. On evaluation, I think it's really important to make the distinction between evidence use and evidence generation, right? And you don't need to do a randomized trial on every project. You don't need to do an impact evaluation on every project, right? I mean, everyone thought at JPAL that we wanted you to do. This was the main thing we said, is don't do it. Don't try and do it everywhere, right? Pick the specific projects, the specific questions. And it may often be that it's not it may not be a CEDA project that you do the evaluation of, right? You fund a group that finds answers to the questions that you have. It is true that when you do a really good impact evaluation, a lot of the benefit comes from just having researchers sit down and say, what is your main thing that you want to change? And it's incredible how much benefit you just get out of those conversations. I'm going to measure your impact. Quantitatively, a lot is going to hang on this. So you tell me what is the main thing you want to change. That conversation amazingly gets you very far, because I can't tell you the number of NGOs who will say, well, we want to improve, people's self-worth. Well, what do you mean by that? Or you want to improve women's empowerment. What do you mean by that? What specific things do you want this girl to do differently? Does an empowered girl do that a non-empowered girl doesn't do in this particular context? I mean, as an evaluator, I spend months sometimes getting people to answer that question, as opposed to some vague thing up there. Now, we don't have the time to do that with every single project, but program officers should be doing that in every single project. And that should then feed into your goals that should be more specific. But the most important thing, and I don't think you should do a baseline for every project. I think we should, again, simplify our evaluation so we do really high quality impact evaluations, and then simpler, standard process evaluations for more projects.
So simplify, 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 but do not oversimplify. But we're clear and crisp. Thank you so much. And you haven't seen enough of Rachel, because you will be joining us at the last panel today as well. Thank you so much. And now we're moving. Thanks.